Hello. Good evening, and welcome to the last of the current series of programs called Literary Lights, which is a series featuring new works by Armenian authors and is a collaboration between the International Armenian Literary Alliance, YALA, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NASR, and the Krikor and Clara Zora Information Center, which doesn't have a pronounceable acronym.
We say
it just flows off the tongue. And this series has been going on since February. It has been an impressive window into some of the exciting work that is being done by Armenian writers, and we're very glad to be a part of it. Please visit the websites, social media channels, and other outlets of these three groups who do important work that deserves and needs your support. Tonight, we will have a conversation between two outstanding writers, as well as great people, and it is a real pleasure to have them both with us. Susan Barba is a poet, translator, and senior editor at the New York Review of Books, and a member of the board of directors of NASR, not necessarily in that order. She is the author of the poetry collections Fair Sun 2017 and Geode 2020, which was a finalist for the New England Book Awards and the Massachusetts Book Awards, while Fair Sun was awarded the Anahid Literary Prize from Columbia University and the Minas and Kohar Tololian Prize. Susan is also the co-editor with Victoria Rowe of I Want to Live, Poems of Shoshana Kirkinian, and presently is the editor of the Literary Field Guide to American Wildflowers, illustrated by Leanne Shapton, which was published late last year and is the occasion for our being here tonight. Susan holds a PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University, where her dissertation focused on the work of Yehishe Charens, Osip Mandelstam, and W.H. Auden. Her poems have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New York Review of Books, Poetry, the Harvard Review, the Yale Review, and elsewhere. She's a very accomplished writer, and we're very pleased to have her here tonight. Jesse Sirigan-Arlen is the inaugural postdoctoral research fellow in Armenian Christian Studies and director of the Krikor and Clara Zora Information Center, which is a joint appointment between the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church and Fordham University. Jesse earned his PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures with a focus in Armenian Studies at UCLA, writing his dissertation, A Window into the 10th Century, the Life and Literary Works of Ananiah of Narek, under the supervision of Professor Peter Cowie. He has taught classical Armenian at the University of Notre Dame and at the Dumbarton Oaks HMML Summer Language Program. His academic research pertains to Armenian monasticism and religious literature from late antiquity to the modern period, and his studies and writings have appeared in various scholarly peer-reviewed journals, and he is also a writer of poetry and creative and critical prose in Western Armenian, which has been published both in Armenia and in the diaspora in outlets including Iknagir, Hayren Blog, Asparez, and Bakina. With that, I hand the controls over to Susan and Jesse for them to speak and converse.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Mark and all of NASR, everyone here. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you, Jesse, for coming from New York and agreeing to be in conversation with me. And I'm also grateful to Yela and Olivia's hard work and Hofsep there. They've been wonderful in supporting this book.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mark, and thanks to NASR for hosting this. And I also wanted to thank Olivia and Hofsep and everyone at YALA for everything they've done with this exciting program. We had Lisa last month at the Zohrab Center, and it's great to be here in Boston or Belmont at NASR. And Susan and I actually met for the first time in person just about a half hour ago. But I wanted to talk about, to get started, my first encounter with Susan, which was a literary encounter with her poetry. When I moved to the New York area after finishing my PhD at UCLA and started at the Zohrab Center, It had been, shut down for COVID for a couple of years, and the donations of books, as you, Mark, and Ani know, those don't stop coming in. Those just always come in and keep piling up. So I entered the office, and there were mounds of books everywhere to go through. And so in some of the initial days, as I'm looking through things, starting to catalog some things or put aside things to do later, I spotted this book, Geode, Poems by Susan Barba, who I hadn't heard of before. And before deciding what to do with it, whether to throw it to the side to be done later, or to catalog it and or just throw it away, you glance through it, you try to see something, and this is only like my third or fourth day in the office. I started reading the beginning, and time just stopped for me. And I was utterly mesmerized by the poetry, by the language. You write from, not just from the head, but from the heart. And there's a kind of intimacy and immediacy in your poetry where you reach the reader's heart. And I remember specifically, just kind of pushing my chair back from my desk, turning the display off my computer. The light was coming in the window, and for the next hour and a half or two, I read it literally cover to cover.
Thank you, Jesse.
And then another first encounter to mention was I wanted to share, something from your poetry with my wife. I was telling her about your poems, and I didn't have your books with me at the time. And so I looked up on your website to find something, and this title, one of your early poems from this book stuck out, which I wanted to ask you to read. How Should We Live Our Lives? I read this out loud to my wife, and my wife is one of these people who regularly cries in the presence of beauty. I know that a classical music concert, or some art we're looking at is truly great if she's crying beside me because she can't help herself. And before I'd finished reading the poem, there were tears coming down her eyes. So I think this would be a great way to start the evening with one of your own poems.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I love that you just happened to pick up Geode. and that we encountered each other that way. So
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Actually, sorry, I'm just gonna. How should we live our lives? With love and trepidation sign our letters? Conceive a child only after much forethought, or none at all? Follow the dialectical heart to world's end and feel it tighten, a muscle to fill again, unfettered? Daughter, as you grow up, I will grow old, a fact that shocks you even at age 3. Love has no part in this. Only the sea is free of such calculations, and sometimes a person too, running into the sea in late summer when the water remembers just barely what it was to be cold.
But we're here tonight to talk about American Wildflowers, a literary field guide, which you were the editor of. And there's a lot to talk about with this book, but maybe a nice way to start would be for you to read a little bit from the introduction, which talks a little bit about the genesis of the book and what you're trying to do with the book.
Yes, I'd love to do that. So this is quite a hefty book. The introduction begins, well, Actually, the introduction begins before the table of contents, which is really massive because it's organized by family of flowers and then by species. And I wanted to put the flowers first. My idea behind this book was to have it be a literary anthology of writing about American wildflowers, but I wanted the flowers themselves to be in the forefront as much as the texts themselves. I wanted it to be like a conversation between, here are the flowers, and there are scientific pieces in this book too, and scientific writing about the flowers. I didn't want it just to be, another sort of literary anthology. But I'll start with the introduction, and I'll read about 5 minutes, the first 2 pages of the introduction. Here on a hill in Massachusetts, the fog is lifting and the sun, still in the east, is turning the yellow leaves gold. The wind is from the east, too, and the clouds are rushing ahead of the bend of light. It is late October. Still in flower are the goldenrods and asters, now waving, now steady at the edge of the grass. The view reminds me of Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem, Afternoon on a Hill, especially the first stanza. I will be the gladdest thing under the sun. I will touch 100 flowers and not pick one. I've just rediscovered this poet, whose entire life's work I put away with childhood. I remember reading Wine from These Grapes, not knowing anything about wine or women or the work of being a poet, but feeling like I'd stumbled on some kind of secret ceremony. I was a girl then in Morris County, New Jersey. My favorite day of the week was Thursday, when I had piano lessons in Florham Park, not because I loved the piano especially, but because we always had time to kill between school and my lesson, time my mother used instead to take me to the Frelinghuysen Arboretum, where we'd walk through the woodlands and meadows. What I liked about those afternoons was that it was just us and the flowers. After my lesson, we'd circle back to the library across the street from the Arboretum, and I would check out as many books as I could carry. Flowers, music, books, all within the same circumference, which I now recognize as a gift my mother gave me. She took me by the hand and introduced me to beauty, and while I put it off later in search of knowledge, I've come around to seeing that the two are related. The beauty is indispensable, and the books are the reproductive proof of it. This book is an attempt to reacquaint myself and others with the wild beauty we live with, to reclaim that beauty from sentimentality, consumerism, preciosity, and exclusivity. I start with the story of my childhood because that is the origin of my feeling for flowers. I think it must be this way for many. Beauty relieves us with its unexpected greeting and even integrates us. However, as a subject, beauty is often suspect. Even now, writing about it causes me some embarrassment, some shame. When there is such suffering in the world, the thinking goes, how can you write about beauty? And yet, beauty is linked to justice, as Elaine Scarry has argued persuasively, through an act that occurs involuntarily in its presence. Quote, at the moment we see something beautiful, we undergo a radical decentering, unquote. Scarry draws on Simone Weil, an ardent advocate for justice, to make her argument. Weil, who described an encounter with beauty as a movement away from, quote, our imaginary position as the center, which allows us to discern that all points in the world are equally centers, unquote, and that the periphery is only a place of sufficient attention. In this way, the experience of beauty may be a beginning, and a wildflower, that most common peripheral presence, a real vector for change in the world. My hope is that this anthology, devoted to writing about American wildflowers, will counter the plant blindness of our dominant culture by exhibiting many of the flowers in the periphery of our vision, the flowers that have been written into our literature. I hope, too, that each of these radically decentering texts will prompt a consideration of that modifying term, American. The language we use to describe people and plants often overlaps, with taxonomies that divide and place value on those divisions, words that actively discriminate. In the scientific literature and in common use, flowers are referred to as native, like sunflowers, or alien, like bluebells. They can be naturalized, like clover, or invasive, like purple loosestrife. There are migrants and exotics, escapes and refugees. The language expresses a position. It reveals a posture in regard to a species. It grants a plant its liberty or sanctions its eradication. The best writers closely observe not only the plant, but our words in relation to it, and in doing so, they focus our attention and clarify our intentions. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, there's so much in these first few paragraphs to draw on, and that struck me also as I was reading your book. One of the things I really wanted to highlight, because I think it's somewhat unique and to me significant in the literary world today, is your repositioning beauty at the center of your project for this book. I think we've become very focused in literature, in art, on questions of identity, of politics, of sex, of gender, of race, and of justice, social justice. While of course these are things of great concern to all of us as you yourself, they shouldn't displace beauty as the real, the unique thing that art is able to do and give us an experience of. And this quote from Simone Weil that you talked about, and this concept of beauty having the power to draw us out of ourselves, made me think of this British philosopher, Iris Murdoch, the 20th century, who herself was a great reader of Simone Weil and an admirer of her thought, and wrote very insightful things in addition to her novels on the philosophy of ethics and also aesthetics. And she has this beautiful little passage where she talks about beauty and the power of both art and nature, which you both capture in this book on what poems and prose about wildflowers. Iris Murdoch in this essay that's called The Sovereignty of Good Over Other Concepts. So you can see already how it's ethics and aesthetics connected together. She has a concept of unselfing, which is being taken out of the self in the encounter either with nature or with great art. And she says, beauty is the convenient and traditional name of something which art and nature share, and which gives a fairly clear sense to the idea of quality of experience and change of consciousness. I am looking out of my window in an anxious and resentful state of mind, oblivious of my surroundings, brooding perhaps on some damage done to my prestige. Then suddenly I observe a hovering kestrel, which is a falcon. In a moment, everything is altered. The brooding self with its hurt vanity has disappeared. There is nothing now but kestrel. And when I return to thinking of the other matter, it seems less important. And of course, this is something which we may also do deliberately. Give attention to nature in order to clear our minds of selfish care. And circling back to the question of ethics and justice, of course, it's our selfishness and our self-centeredness that's the cause of so much of the problems in the world. And so it's the great power of beauty and great art to take us out of ourselves. And I think it's so important, you repositioning beauty as the focus of your project. And along the way, you took care of all the other questions and concerns. Because in this anthology, it's so comprehensive and it's as diverse and beautifully multifarious as this country and its history, with writers going back from the 18th century, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, up until contemporary writers today. Men, women, people of all different ethnic backgrounds and extractions, all coming together to make an anthology and collection as beautiful and varied as the many different wildflowers that they're writing about. So maybe you could just say a little bit more about some of those things.
Sure, of course, Jessie. I love the Iris Murdoch passage, that it's so apt. And I see the connection immediately. It's almost like a continuation of, and I'm sure I have to go back to the Elaine Scarry book on beauty, but she may even reference Murdoch too. I think that, I know with my own writing, a lot of it is generated by encounters with beauty, but it can also be generated by anger. It can also be generated by feelings of a need to speak up. But I agree that we seem to be heavily weighted by the justice side and not connecting that justice piece with the beauty in terms of American poetry, at least. At the moment. But if you read a lot of the poems and prose in this book, there are beauty and anger can coexist in the same poem, right? They can coexist in the same moment. You can be writing a call to arms and look up and see the kestrel, and it takes you out of that, and then you can feel anger at yourself for being distracted from the task at hand by beauty, but it is necessary. It's a necessary, and it's an integral part of us as human beings, I think. And without that, our art is much the poorer for it. So thank you for highlighting that aspect. Maybe I could say a little bit about the range of the writing in this book.
Yeah, I would love to hear about, I'm sure everyone would love to hear about, it's a fairly unique project, it seems to me, to gather these different pieces like you did, and also I would imagine might have even been a little daunting at the outset. There's so much material out there to choose from, but what was your method or process like? How did you find the pieces that ultimately came into this book? And yeah.
So it never felt daunting. It was such a joy. And most of the collecting came about during the pandemic, so it was really it really kept me alive in a really, intellectually, spiritually, just in the sense that I felt like I was having all these positive encounters. So maybe I'll just go back a little bit further even and say how the idea came about. I was talking to a friend and someone whom I had worked with in my role as an editor at NYRB, New York Review of Books. He's an author, a British author, and an environmental journalist for The Independent. And we were having a conversation. He was on his way to Virginia to give a talk on meadow restoration at a place called Oak Spring Garden Foundation, which is this organization in Virginia devoted to horticulture, landscape preservation. It was the home of the Mellons, Bunny Mellon, who was a garden designer and a botanist, and it's now a center for scholars and artists. And he said, I've been thinking a lot about wildflowers and wondering if they have a presence in American literature as much as they do in English literature and British literature. And I thought about it a little bit, and I said, yeah, they do. They really do. Although, I think in English, one thinks of Wordsworth and Shakespeare, and flowers immediately come to mind. But we have those flowers in our literature too. And so, talking with him more, I got thinking about the idea of an anthology of writing about American wildflowers. And as it turned out, Oak Spring, the Garden Foundation, was also interested in this project. So they were the ones who actually made it possible for this book to exist, because they supported the book by paying for the permissions, which are really the most onerous part of any anthology, because you have permissions for these pieces and they can get very expensive, and usually publishers will not cover them. So that's a real obstacle. And they also initially paid for the first 12 paintings, and then the publisher covered the rest of the art. So that was the impetus for the book, and I started with a selection of poems that were just close to me and that I knew and loved already, and then began talking with people in the field of American literature and friends, poets, and requesting books from libraries, because by this time the libraries had all closed, but you could still, thanks to wonderful librarians, you could still, send a list of books that you wanted, and they would deliver them to the main pickup station at the library, the vestibule, and that occurred many, many times. So I ended up with really a critical number of pieces, and it was due to the publisher who said, at a certain point, I don't think the book can be longer than 300 pages, and I had to cut a few, but I really wanted it to have a range of not just poems, but also writing by scientists, by botanists, by environmentalists, by agronomists. There are, the earliest writing is William Bartram, who was the first American-born botanist. American-born meaning colonial American. There's writing in here by Native American, current contemporary Native American writers who are writing oral stories that were handed down orally that predate Bartram. There's not as much as that as I would like. That was really difficult to find. What I was really hoping for, I have, and we can discuss the Francisco Alarcón poem, which there is one poem, there are a few bilingual pieces in here. There's a Hawaiian piece that has an English translation as well. But I wanted to find earlier texts that were not written in English, that were exemplary of this earlier writing about wildflowers. So I wanted it to have all these different valences, and in that way to represent the flowers themselves, because the flowers are only American by our calling them so. And just to circle back to, I know we're sitting in Nasser, and this is far-fetched for a book. That there's a very tenuous Armenian connection here, but I do think, and I'm thinking about this more actually for my next own manuscript of poems, about what do we mean by our flowers, and these flowers that come from everywhere, they're part of our lives, but they're not necessarily American. They're on American soil, but they're American just by virtue of the people who are here at this moment. And I found this Armenian field guide. What is the Armenian title? Mershurjani Ner, something like that. But what struck me was the pronoun mer, because it occurred to me that how beautiful and generous this title was, the flowers of our region. and it just assumed that whoever could read it was included. And so I began thinking about, you know, are those Armenian flowers my flowers as well? You know, how do we think of possession in that way? So I will be writing more about that.
Well, one thing that might be interesting to say too, this came up a little bit in the intro with regard to the definitions around flowers or terms in relation to exotic or native or these kind of things. What was significant to you about it being wildflowers as opposed to maybe, I don't know, cultivated flowers in a garden? Or what's the opposite of wildflower, or what's significant about it being wildflowers?
Yeah, so cultivated would be the opposite, and cultivated to me, you know, there are varying shades, I guess, from how a flower gets from a wildflower, which is growing, which could be a weed, to a cultivated flower that is valued and prized and not eradicated. But I was interested in flowers that were free of human influence, even though that might not be the case, you know, but to have that sort of pure ideal, flowers that are not prized, that are often overlooked, that are forgotten, that exist because nature exists without us. And there is also an environmental, you know, bent to this book. I did want to bring people's attention to flowers that don't exist in gardens by design, that are being eradicated because of climate change, because of, you know, habitat loss, because of development, and to learn more about that myself by working on this book. I think that there's, you know, the horticulture and cultivated flowers have a lot of fans. There are a lot, you know, they have their own genre of garden writing, and that's not my specialty. I'm more interested in the sort of in between.
Yeah. Well, you are uniquely, names are significant, and you're uniquely maybe called to write about flowers with your name Susan, or Shushan.
Yes.
Which is a lily, or a kind of lily from a Persian word. So I just had to throw that out there.
Yes, I love it.
Maybe you could read something from the book to give a taste of some of the pieces from the book.
And then maybe you could
Yes.
too.
Mm-hmm.
How are we doing on time? We're okay. Oh, I marked the one you were going to read, not the one that I was going to read. Hold on, I've got other. Here it is. Okay. So this is a poem by Rita Dove, who's an American poet, a distinguished American poet living in Washington, D.C., African-American poet. Evening Primrose. Neither rosy, nor prim, nor cousin to the cowslip, nor the extravagant fuchsia. I doubt anyone has ever picked one for show, though the woods may be fringed with their lemony effusions. Sun blathers its baronial endorsement, but they refuse to join the ranks. Summer brings them in armfuls, yet when the day is large, you won't see them fluttering the length of the road. They'll wait until the world's tucked in and the sky's one ceaseless shimmer, then lift their saturated eyelids and blaze all night long for no one. And here's a picture, I don't know if you can see this. Unfortunately, I didn't have slides of these illustrations, but they're really beautiful. Leanne Chapton. They're like portraits of flowers. They're as far from botanical illustrations as possible. And I wanted the book to have illustrations that had their own character, not to be, realistic depictions of flowers, and that's really what they are.
And they're watercolors.
They're watercolors,
Yeah.
yes, and they were painted with, I wish he was here to talk about it because it's really fascinating. They were painted with paints that are all natural. The pigment is derived from all natural sources, so essentially from plants. And she said that they've already started fading because they have no preservative in them. So the colors that you see in the book, which are so vibrant, she scanned them as soon as she finished painting, and they're now, they're like sepia now. They're no longer in these bright, vivid colors.
Well, I wanted to read one that you had alluded to earlier, Francisco Alarcón, I think it is, called In Xochitl in Cuicatl, which are Navajo words, I think, meaning flower and song. And this is one of the bilingual poems in the collection. And as I was reading it, it really stuck out to me as I was reading some selections from the book. It's very beautiful, and occasionally I'll translate poetry from English to Armenian, kind of as an exercise for myself, but also to bring some interesting American or contemporary poetry into Armenian, and I'll send it to Ishkhan Chikjian at Hayden blog, and he'll put it up. So I translated this one to Armenian and sent it to him about a month ago. So I thought maybe I'd read the original and then my Armenian translation. And just to give something amusing for everyone, I'll attempt to read it in the original Spanish too. But unfortunately, I've never taken Spanish before. But I can read Spanish, and I did translate it mostly from the Spanish, but some of the pronunciation might be off, but you'll forgive me. Okay. Cada árbol un hermano, cada monte una pirámide, un oratorio, cada valle un poema, in Xochitl, in Cuicatl, flor y canto, cada nube una plegaria, cada gota de lluvia un milagro, cada cuerpo una orilla al mar, un olvido encontrado. Todos juntos, luciérnagas de la noche, soñando el cosmos. Every tree a brother, every hill a pyramid, a holy spot. Every valley a poem, in Xochitl, in Cuicatl, flower and song. Every cloud a prayer, every raindrop a miracle, every body a seashore, a memory, at once lost and found. We all together, fireflies in the night, dreaming up the cosmos. Amen zar yechpair, amen pelur avotaram, amen sor panastelzutun, Xochitl mech, Cuicatl mech, zaig uyerk, amen amb avolk, ansrevi amen gatil, harashk, amen marmin zovezerk, hishadag, mortzvaz, kutnavaz, amenkas havasar, gaitzorigner, kishervan, yerazelov, diazerka.
Beautiful. Oh, that was just amazing to hear it in Armenian. Thank you, Jesse. I feel like we should continue that and just have it translated into every language.
It's such,
That'd be amazing, the Flower and Song
yeah,
Project.
they're like such fundamental elements of creation and human
Yes.
experience that it sounds so powerful, I think, in any language or every
Yes.
language.
Yes,
Yeah.
beautiful. Well, how much time do we have? Are we?
How much time do you need?
Well, maybe we could open up to questions, but actually before that, I wanted to read one other piece, which I first wanted to mention how struck I was and impressed with the diversity of poets in here. So many, I would say more than half were unknown to me and are new writers who I'm reading in your collection for the first time. But there was one writer who I really love and think is quintessentially an American writer who also writes so much about nature and with you shares many of the same environmental concerns and concerns about human beings' relationship with the earth and with the planet, and writes about those issues in a way that is not ideological or off-putting to people, but is really focusing on the core issues and the just fragility of life on the planet, the life of the planet, and also human existence on the planet, and that's Wendell Berry. And he has this beautiful passage from one of his essays. It's in a collection called The Art of the Commonplace, which is a title that you could say maybe about to describe a lot of your poetry,
Yes.
I would say. The editors of that collection called this first essay of his, A Native Hill, they called it a geobiography. So the way his biography is tied to the environment he grew up in. For him, it was Port Royal, Kentucky. For you, it was New Jersey and New York. And in this little selection that I wanted to read, it's from a prose piece, he talks about coming across a patch of bluebells, flowers in the woods, and the effect they have on him. And I think that what he talks about here is just the kind of thing that you were doing in this book. He says, one early morning last spring, I came and found the woods floor strewn with bluebells. In the cool sunlight and the lacy shadows of the spring woods, the blueness of those flowers, their elegant shape, their delicate fresh scent, kept me standing and looking. I found a delight in them that I cannot describe and that I will never forget. Though I had been familiar for years with most of the spring woods flowers, I had never seen these and had not known they were here. Looking at them, I felt a strange loss and sorrow that I had never seen them before. But I was also exultant that I saw them now, that they were here. For me, in the thought of them will always be the sense of the joyful surprise with which I found them. The sense that came suddenly to me then that the world is blessed beyond my understanding, more abundantly than I will ever know. What lives are still ahead of me here to be discovered and exulted in tomorrow or in 20 years? What wonder will be found here on the morning after my death? Though as a man I inherit great evils and the possibility of great loss and suffering, I know that my life is blessed and graced by the yearly flowering of the bluebells. How perfect they are. In their presence I am humble and joyful. If I were given all the learning and all the methods of my race, I could not make one of them, or even imagine one. Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. It is the privilege and the labor of the apprentice of creation to come, with his imagination into the unimaginable, and with his speech into the unspeakable.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jessie. Wendell Berry will be in volume 2 of American Wildflowers for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are so many.
Yes, I was, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. And I enjoyed hearing your conversation and the beautiful poems and essays. I had realized that we had scheduled this event on right before Hampartsum, which is the Ascension, and which is also known as John Gulu. Now, I don't know how old that word is, but it's got Gül in it, which means rose. And in fact, it's the holiday. I was looking it up today, and I don't know how much of this is true, but it's all about spring and flowers and young women going into the fields and having this special permission to just kind of go off into the fields, you know, on their own and pick wildflowers and pick herbs and bring them home. And then I think there's also an aspect of their future is connected with it. They create like a special, I don't know, water-filled pot of flowers, and then their future is somehow defined in this water-filled pot. But in addition to that, at midnight, on the night of Hampartsum or John Gülüm, something very special happens. The earth embraces the sky, the water becomes totally still, and nature starts to speak. And the flowers and the herbs start to speak, and they talk about the different cures that they can create from their flowers. Anyway, I was just totally entranced. I had never heard anything like this before, and I wondered, have you or anyone here come across this idea of the flowers speaking and this time, this special liminal time, you know, it only occurs for a second at midnight, where the flowers start to speak and talk about their cures, the way they can cure, I guess, the ills of the world.
No, I have not, and I would love to know what was the source?
Well, I just went online, and
Okay.
I could probably send it to you.
Okay.
And I just, I had looked up Hampartsum before and John Gülüm, but I never run across this particular source. And I'd only done it this year, and only because Tenny Apelian, who's going to be doing a program tomorrow on Hampartsum right here, with songs and dance, that she brought it up, and I thought, well, I know nothing about Hampartsum, and you know, I know that it's a Christian holiday, but I don't know, other than there's an ascension involved.
Right.
But I had no idea there was a connection to a pagan holiday, and that this holiday was called John Gülüm. I had no idea. So all of this is just new to me. I will send you the source.
Yeah. It's
Do you know,
also
Jessie?
no, it's also kind of new to me, but I'm so intrigued by the way you talked about it, Judy. I'm definitely gonna look that up also. It makes me think of some of the medicinal books in Armenia, the Pazhishkarams, with their recipes for healing, which almost all of which are drawn from the local flora of the regions and how to mix them in different ways to make ointments or different things you drink that provide remedies for various things. And it's so interesting, this idea of the flowers or the herbs speaking to you and telling you the power of what they can do, which is like almost like a folk or mythological sort of representation of what Simone Weil and Iris Murdoch are talking about in abstract philosophical terms about
Yes.
beauty and nature calling to us and speaking to us, you know.
Yes.
It's so interesting.
Yes, and you see, there are instances in here of the flowers speaking, but contemporary poems where the rose speaks. But to think that that goes back to such an ancient source, that there's continuity there, there's a thread there, is fascinating.
Yeah, I was really taken by the idea of the speaking, right?
Mhm.
That the flowers are speaking. So, and how far back does that go? I mean, it could go back, thousands of years.
Mhm.
And so I think about that having to do with our relationship with nature and earth and, the skies, et cetera, and how our ancient selves, our ancestors were so much more connected to all of these things.
Mhm.
And that we are so unconnected, and that we have to kind of reorient ourselves entirely to think about, flowers, wildflowers in the way that they affect us.
Mhm.
And yet they just naturally were just absorbing all of this at the time. It makes me think of how much we've lost
Yeah.
as human beings, and so it goes back to what you were talking about what we're losing all the time because of climate change and development. We're just losing more and more of this.
And also just life in cities and post-industrial, world. But I loved how you connected it with your own childhood. And for many of us who live in cities and places, it's in our childhoods that we were most connected with nature, running around, playing in the creek, or running in fields of wildflowers and things like that. Yeah.
But don't you think you can bridge that distance with attention too? Even if you're in a city, there are places to go, and it doesn't have to be a pristine wilderness. You can find wildness in an abandoned lot, in a park. You can get close to the flowers, but it's a matter of your attention, I think, just as much as it is, place. I think there are limitations to place, but attention is also a big part of it. Not to put the onus on everyone individually, but I do think that's possible to get closer. Not as close maybe as our ancestors were, but closer than we are usually. Any other questions?
Well, now Nasser is at the forefront of the celebration of Hamparsum and Jahilu with the event tonight and tomorrow's event with
Yes.
Pavilion.
All flowers all the time.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you, Susan.
This has been really
Thank you both, thank you everyone, and there are, as I think you know, copies of this lovely book for sale and on sale tonight, so please do check it out, and the editor will gladly sign them for you as well, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and see you soon. Please come back for Hamparsum.